For many people, technology has become the number one resource of getting more knowledge, skills, and many other things nowadays. That's why we are proud to provide our new mega project, Vigor Digital Learning Hub, VDLH. VDLH is a digital service that helps organizations to continue their learning journeys for their employees by providing learning solutions that needed for mastering different knowledge and skills for greater performance through various updated and important topics. We are providing digital learning services like webinars, virtual simulations, online assessments, live sessions, virtual conferences and exhibitions, virtual reality, business consultation, and coaching sessions. VDLH providing tailored training topics that will help HR organizations to boost up their learning performance and engagement. We are providing personal skills, business topics, relationship skills. VDLH is providing their learning in different digital tools that will support the learning solutions with the most efficient ways to deliver a full learning experience. The number one rule of achieving your goal is taking action, and with VDLH, we will make sure that every single action you take will be calculated, effective, and always supported by us. Start now. Contact us for more details. VDLH, Endless Learning.
Hello everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, Making Great Decisions in Crisis. Thank you for taking time out and being here today. We will be running a live Q&A at the end of the webinar, so you can enter your questions in the chat box. It's on the right-hand side of your screen. Today is a totally different. We hope you are having your notebook with you, because today you will get a piece of fabulous information and hands-on experience. As we promised you, also as a part of our presentations and responsibilities at Vigor Enterprise to help everyone to overcome this tough time, we are continuing our support to the community by providing our free series of webinars through VDLH, Vigor Digital Learning Hub. Our digital service to help individuals and organizations to continue the learning journeys anytime, anywhere in the world. And tonight, we have an amazing guest with amazing success stories with Vigor Enterprise in the past years, Mr. James van der Westhuizen. James is a very experienced virtual learning facilitator and decision-making expert. He's a trusted advisor to many blue-chip organizations and leading executives. He has been active since 1998 as the managing member of Know House, a globally respected organization in development and change consultancy, active across the African continent, Asia, and the Middle East. He also led large-scale organizational development and change projects for major public and private sectors. Please, let us all welcome Mr. James.
Good evening, everybody. How are you this evening? These are certainly strange times. What a wonderful occasion to be here together with you. I, of course, would have preferred to be there in person with you today, but absolutely wonderful to be amongst definitely the most welcoming and most warm-hearted people in the world. So it's fantastic to be with you. And I look forward to spending some time discussing with you tonight a topic that is so important and yet something that we hardly ever get taught. We're going to talk tonight about making decisions. And as I was preparing for this evening, I came across this decision by Theodore Roosevelt, the historic leader of the United States. And he said, in any moment of decision, the best thing you can do is the right thing. The next best thing you can do is the wrong thing, and the worst thing you can do is nothing. And this is the challenge we're facing today. We're facing a challenge of unprecedented times where it's very hard to make decisions. So we're going to talk today about making a decision in crisis. And we're going to share with you some ideas. We're going to ask you to participate in some live polls. And I'd love to see your questions, your comments, and whatever you are dealing with and struggling with. Hopefully there'll be time at the end for a lot of interaction. And we're going to work our way through a decision-making framework that hopefully will help you to make better decisions in this time when decision-making is very challenging. So I'd like to start off with a little poll, and I'd like you to, when the poll starts, just reflect a little bit on this time of massive uncertainty. Who would have known in the beginning of this year that we would have had an oil price going close to negative, a massive global pandemic that has shut us all in our houses and has massive economic and human devastation, a United States that seems at the moment to be consistently on the brink of open riots, and so many massive changes happening at the same time. Now, as we face this and we have to make decisions in our families, in our businesses, how do we face up to that? And I'd like to start off with a little poll. And I'd like to ask you, as we put the poll on the screen, what do you do when you have to make decisions in times of high uncertainty? So we're popping a poll on the screen there. Do we typically second guess our decisions more? Do we tend to procrastinate and wait? Do we sometimes get stuck in this paralysis of trying to find more and more information? Do we kind of typically trust our gut and our instincts? And do we sometimes wish we were more confident and we feel like we don't have all the information? I want to give it a few minutes just for you to tell us honestly, how have you experienced decision-making in this time of massive uncertainty? Love to see your views. And I hope the sound from my side is good, folks. If there is any challenges, please let us know. I know we had a bit of an echo in the beginning introduction. I hope the sound is good. Really interesting results that are coming in. A kind of a tie between the folks who say, I'll go with my gut. I'll go with my gut instinct. And the folks who say, I get stuck in this analysis where I try to analyze and think and rethink and sometimes get it to really be quite difficult to make decisions. So I'm going to let it run for another minute or two. And I'd like you to just reflect. Thanks, Walid, for saying the sound is good. And Marwa, fantastic to hear from you. And lovely to have you with us today. Saif, I'm glad you're excited. I'm super excited to be with you. And some folks from Kuwait, from Oman, from all kinds of places. So wonderful to be with you and spend this time with you tonight. So yes, it seems like it's kind of a split between trusting our gut and getting stuck in analysis paralysis. We're going to talk a little bit about decision-making, and specifically decision-making in these times of massive, massive uncertainty. So if you're still voting, pop the vote in there, and let's get your view, and then I'm going to move on. Really interesting perspectives. Thank you for participating. Right, so let's move on. And I want to talk to you a little bit about the situation that we are facing at the moment. How are we facing this time of uncertainty? And I think the last couple of months have felt specifically uncertain. I think we have used the word unprecedented, and we can close the poll. I'd love to see the final round on that. It does seem that analysis paralysis is kind of quite close to the gut instinct. So let's see what happened to us in these last couple of months. And please keep your comments and your views coming in. On the one hand, it feels like in some way our whole relationship with time have changed. Have you also experienced that? That just structuring your day, what decisions we should make, how should we do it? That's one thing that I've experienced. And we've also felt that sometimes making even the smallest decisions has become quite difficult, especially when it comes to spending decisions. I find a lot of our colleagues in business really struggling to decide, should we conserve cash? Should we invest in the future? Should we innovate? So even small decisions in our daily life because I guess we find that the big uncertainties and the small uncertainties start feeding into each other. And we find that we sometimes have to apply different decision-making approaches. Say, if I agree with you, literally time is upside down. And the idea is, how do we package decisions? How do we make decisions so that we can remain effective and this blurred line of decision-making is not there? In some ways, a metaphor that we can use is to say that we can sort of say that our crystal ball has become kind of cloudy. Our ability to predict the future, our ability to find out what is actually happening with us is become difficult for us. I'm sure you've experienced that time, that experience is sometimes really valuable in decision making. Especially those of you who said, I trust my gut. What you're really saying is that I trust my experience. I trust the fact that I've faced this quite often. We've been engaging with some of our colleagues in Greece over the last couple of months, and they said that they've actually felt that, because they went through such a massive economic crisis, this pandemic felt like something a bit familiar to them, which was an interesting perspective for me. So what has also happened is that everything that applied 4 months ago, in some ways, apart from our basic core beliefs and our spirituality, I guess that stays intact. But those things no longer apply. And our brains are scrambling to process what they haven't seen it before. We don't know what we can rely on and how things used to work. And I love what Nader is saying there. We are overwhelmed with decision fatigue. So many decisions to make. What a beautiful comment. And I think, Hend is saying there, we currently have so much fewer decisions. We just stay at home. And that is also true. In some ways, our decisions are infinite. And in some ways, it's really hard to make decisions. So in this time, we typically default into one of two decision-making strategies. And it was quite interesting. It came up exactly the same in the poll as well. The one is we trust our intuition, trust our gut, and we go with our gut. And the other is that we use careful, rational analysis and logic. The folks who wrote this, Daniel Kahneman, he talks about system one decision-making, which is that gut feel-based decision-making. And then we have the careful, rational thinking decision-making, where we really try and write down all the pros and cons. Kahneman calls that system two decision-making. Now, what would possibly be some of the traps, do you think, of each one of those? Of course, the gut feel decision-making, much faster, and the kind of rational analysis is a lot slower. Just give me an idea in chat. What do you think might be the risks of each one of those decision-making approaches? Where might we make a mistake if we go with our gut all the time? And where do you think we might actually make a mistake by being too careful and too analytical in our decision-making? Pop some comments into chat. What do you think? And, we saw we've got a bit of both in this group. What do you think are some of the risks of the one versus the other? The gut feel, folks. When do you think? Exactly, Bashar. We sometimes miss out on crucial information. We'll talk a lot more about gut feel later. But one of the things with gut feel is typically the more experienced you are, the more you've mastered a specific domain, the more you can trust your gut. And the real danger comes when we actually trust our gut without the necessary kind of experience of the field. So the better your experience, we might make some mistakes. Jitendra, I agree with you. And then Saif says, over-analysis can blur the line between right and wrong. Absolutely. So the risks that we're looking at is, on the one hand, we have a faster decision-making process. On the other hand, a slower. The faster means we might have knee-jerk reactions. We might react because we believe we've already kind of figured out what's going to happen. But the slow decision-making can be analysis paralysis. And as someone said, we can sometimes, like Magda said, we can sometimes take so long to make the decision that the decision actually moves out from underneath us. So how do we actually understand this? And how do we focus and how do we find our way between these two ways of making decision? And one of the tips that I can give you right up front is try to understand your default way of making decisions. If you're a gut feel kind of a decision maker, maybe put a little bit more time in writing down some notes and making a list. If you're more of an analytical decision maker, try and identify those areas where you have a lot of experience, where you've seen it all before, and maybe try and create some gut feel in terms of that. So great, some really nice stuff. Rational analysis could be less agile. Yes, absolutely. Which one is the most powerful? Well, I guess they're all powerful in their own way, right? On the one hand, the gut feel decision making feels powerful because it's got such a great emotional connection with us. A rational analysis, of course, can be powerful if we have a lot of elements to take into consideration. A great question. We'll talk about that later. So in this time of uncertainty and anxiety and lack of control, we quite often make bad decisions. We make knee-jerk decisions. And the reason for that is, A, we're under a lot of emotional pressure, and B, the one thing that normally saves us when we do gut feel decisions, that sense that we have actually got experience, very few of us have experience of the current situation. So it's very difficult for us to really make a good gut feel decision at the moment. So let's think a little bit about instinct, intuition, gut feel decisions. What do we mean when we talk about those? Right? So we have, in our mind, our brain is an incredibly powerful processing engine. Yes, absolutely safe. You know, we should possibly use both, right? Especially with judgment calls. So we've got these two massive processes that are playing out in our brain. And we need to understand them because they can help us understand when we can trust our gut. There are times when a gut feel decision can be very, very valuable. So let's have a look at a couple of elements here. Two things that happen in our brain, and our brain is our biggest helper, But at the same time, it can be our biggest enemy, right? And Jitendra, you're right. If you are very young and you don't have experience, gut feel decisions could be very dangerous. So two big brain processes, pattern recognition and emotional tagging. Now, those are things that happen in our brain that help us simplify information. Pattern recognition, of course, is when we say, I've seen something a bit like this. I might be walking down a street. I might have been in a dangerous situation in my life before. I see some dark shadows. I immediately recognize that pattern. I realize this is a dangerous place for me to be, and I immediately can make a very quick decision. But that same pattern recognition that helps us simplify information can also give us incorrect recognition. The other element is this deep primordial thing inside of us of emotional tagging, right? Where we connect a good or a bad emotion to a situation. And sometimes that overrides our ability to make rational decision making. Okay. But these things that allow us to cope with complexity in our world also sometimes distort with our ability to collect and process information. Right? So what do we do? How do we think? How do we improve our skills? And how do we avoid decisions that we later regret? And I'm going to talk to you about the UPS model. You know, UPS, just like the parcel delivery service, I'm sure you've got UPS. I was speaking to the Vigo folks earlier. They say everything is delivered at the moment. Good time to be in parcel delivery. And UPS in our model stands for the three letters U, P, and S. And those are decision traps that sometimes happen to us when we allow our brains to use their strengths to actually become a weakness. The first, the U in UPS, is traps about undoing uncertainty. So those are traps that help us because our brain hates uncertainty. One of the toughest things to live, you know, sometimes when we're worried about a sick family member, we'd rather know where they are, even if they end up being in hospital, than not knowing where they are. Right. Undoing uncertainty. Our brain loves to undo uncertainty. It loves to help us simplify things. The second piece with undoing uncertainty is to create uncertainty, of course. And then the second one is seeking simplicity. This is actually very simple. This is very similar. It's just boils down to one or two different things. And our brain helps us to make things simpler. The problem is it makes it too simple sometimes. And the last is that we are pattern-seeking creatures. So we typically look for patterns because we are dealing with a massive amount of information, and therefore we typically look for patterns. And sometimes we see patterns where there are no patterns. It causes a lot of problem in marriage, if we start saying, well, I saw you do this, and then you do this, and you do this, and that means I've put it all together and I see a pattern. So if we think of these decision traps, think of those three categories: UPS, uncertainty, simplicity, and pursuing patterns. Those are the three things, the traps that we fall into. And together we have a series of decision traps, and we can learn to spot them, and they can help us make better decisions. So we can't completely eliminate it. And we're going to look at a couple of traps now that are very prevalent today in our current situation. We're going to look at availability as a trap. We're going to look at another trap, which is frame blindness. And a third trap that we're going to look at is the status quo trap. So we're going to look at a couple of different traps that are specifically prevalent in these times that we are living in at the moment. And we're going to give you a little decision trap analysis tool at the end of the session, which will help you. But let's look at those traps in a little bit more detail. These three traps, availability, frame blindness, and status quo, are ones that are specifically dangerous at the moment. And let's have a look at them in a little bit more detail. Let's look first, and we're going to show a little video about the availability trap. Now, the availability trap has to do with something that just happened. I've just heard about something, and therefore it is much more available to us, and therefore we tend to overestimate it. So I'd like you to have a look at this availability trap, and I'd like you to think as you watch this video, where have you seen evidence of this decision-making trap, specifically in these times that we are living in? So let's just share and have a look at this video together quickly. And keep the chat coming. I'm loving the interaction and the engagement.
The availability trap is our tendency to be overly influenced by recent or dramatic events when assessing options, or to rely on material that's easily available rather than pursuing the most valid information. We do this because our brains are trying to be efficient. Recent events and information are more easily retrieved in memory and let us take quick action. To our ancestors, this was valuable in avoiding danger, but today it can also be a trap. You should watch for the availability trap when you've recently seen stories or accounts related to your decision, or after a dramatic event has occurred. It can also be an issue when you are estimating and forecasting future events. The information that's quickly available might not be the most important for the estimate. The availability trap can lead us to misjudge risk. We see dramatic risks as more serious than those that are less familiar, and it can lead to decisions being made based on inadequate information. Tips for avoiding the availability trap include: check whether there is recent or dramatic information or media coverage related to your decision. Ask, are you giving that information too much weight? To put the information in proper perspective, consider the real likelihood of its occurrence in relationship to the decision you are making. When forecasting and estimating, ask how much you're relying on recent or easily available information. Could that be skewing your estimate?
Right, so there's a great question from Amit. Availability trap. I think that the availability trap is specifically prevalent. I'm sure that all of you would have remembered the first time you heard about someone or someone in your community getting diagnosed with COVID-19 or the coronavirus. We'll get to the undoing uncertainty behavior, Magna. Just remind me if I don't get to it at the end of this process. And we all of a sudden have this massively available information to us. And it becomes something that we really focus on. And today with social media and how small the world has become, we see these pictures of empty shelves, all the hand sanitizers sold out. And one of the things that happened is that we actually find ourselves stocking up on things that we find necessity. I don't know if you had it in the country where you are at the moment. Did you also have the big run on toilet paper? Toilet paper, people stocking up on toilet paper as if will never be available again. People were piling up and actually created a scarcity. And you're right, Cephas, we don't have enough information, so we look at what is actually most prevalent to us. And all of a sudden, you have this massive rush, people seeing photographs of toilet paper. And in fact, in most countries, the requirement for toilet paper was not really that much higher than it is in a normal situation. And in reality, COVID is not even a kind of disease that is likely to increase the usage of toilet paper, right? So that is a good example of the availability trap. We see these massive, compelling images of something, and because something is recent, we probably find that with our medical personnel as well, that today, because they are, yes, then it was in the US and the UK as well, very strongly. Luckily in South Africa, we also seem to not have too much of a crisis, but the sanitizers, that definitely went off the shelves really quickly. Now, here's an interesting example. If you were to go and visit New York City, now remember the time when we still used to travel, if you were to visit New York City, would you be worried? Ah, that's right, you've got to be there in every house. So resilience, that's absolutely true. Probably could push up the sales of B-days, right? So if you were to go to New York City, what would be your biggest worry? Let's say you're going to New York City and you're going to spend a bit of time on the beach as well, going for a swim. Maybe just pop in the chat. What would you be most worried about, and specifically given for your visit to the beach at New York City? What would you be most worried about if you go for a swim in the ocean off the coast there? What would your biggest worry be? Especially possibly if you've just seen the movie Jaws, right? I don't know if you saw the movie Jaws. What would be your biggest worry? Australia, absolutely. And I know in Reunion Island at one stage they had a big problem with that. And I guess, Jitendra, what you're referring to there is a possibility of a shark attack, right? But would you, if you send your kids or your family for a visit to New York City, and please don't think about New York City today with the riots, but would you be worried about them getting bitten by another person while they're in New York City? Would that be a worry that you would have? Probably not, because we don't often hear about people being bitten by people. But one shark attack creates such massive, massive news that we would be quite worried about that. And actually, there's an interesting statistic. The annual number of people who get bitten worldwide by sharks is 10 times less than the number of people who get bitten by other people in New York City. So you've got far better chance of getting bitten by another human being in New York City than getting bitten by a shark worldwide. Now, this is a very good example of our availability trap, right? About a situation where information that is vivid, that is very compelling, actually shapes our views. So next time you go to New York City, don't worry about the sharks. Just make sure if someone walks up to you with an open mouth, you might get bitten. So take that into consideration. So I want to do a quick thing in chat, and I want to talk to you about one decision that you think you've made recently. It could be an important or a small decision that you felt maybe was overly influenced by what you saw in the news. Something that was available, something that happened maybe on the other side of the world, So just give me in chat one decision that now in retrospect, yeah, safe sharks disguised as humans. Absolutely. What do you think is a decision that you might have made in the last couple of weeks where you were a little bit too influenced by the availability of news? What would you think? Can somebody give me an example? Be brave. Give me an example of one decision that you made that was maybe over influenced by what was available and top of mind. I know, for example, at the moment when I have a bit of a cough, I immediately think it's COVID, right? Immediately. The fact that I have long-standing problems with sinusitis that caused me absolutely laying off employees. Things are changing on the other side of the world, and we all of a sudden we perceive there to be a massive threat to our business. Yeah, keep it coming. Other stocking up food. Absolutely. I know that I went and I stocked the pantry with all kinds of, at one stage you couldn't get pasta. Mohammed bought a lot of masks. Absolutely. Canned food. Yes. We've got a good confession going on here. Stocking up on food. Absolutely. A lot of us did that. And probably in a year's time, we'll have to explain to people why we have so many cans of pasta and pasta sauce in our cupboards. Now, availability, started avoiding people. Absolutely. Stop buying unnecessary stuff. Absolutely. Some really excellent comments. Folks, lovely. I love the interaction, by the way. Massive credit to Vigor for this really interactive kind of session group of people. Yeah, people not willing to see patients with flu symptoms because they are immediately think about COVID. Absolutely fantastic. So how can we avoid this challenge that we have with being overly influenced? There are two ways that we can think about possibly overcoming the availability trap. The first is be aware when there is a lot of dramatic information. One plane crash will make us worried about flying much more than 50 reports of vehicle accidents. And yet we know that flying is far safer than driving in a motor vehicle. So please be aware if you're making a decision, just do a little checklist in your mind to say, how much of this information have I been absorbing and where has that information come from? With the shrinking of the globe, we have become exposed. I myself have been glued to the screen to see the images coming from the US and saying, wow, is that going to happen where I am as well? The second aspect is try and get a little bit statistical. So, what is the actual number of infections in my environment? I'm not saying to anybody to be irresponsible, right? We're all looking at massive growth curves at the moment. But let's get a sense of what the actual odds are of this happening. And we'll talk a little bit later about loss aversion as well, a little bit later. Quite often the way we frame our decisions also makes a very big difference. So try to get factual. When you are facing a barrage of news information, it's easy to get pulled in. I've got some great comments here by Hassam and Jitendra as well. Where does the information come from? We live in the era of fake news and people being able to amplify news, and you kind of feel that things are really going to change massively. So that's one way. Availability trap has often got to do with recent, highly emotional, very visual information. And it can easily get us sidetracked from that perspective. So great, some excellent stuff. The next trap I wanted to talk to you about is one of my favorites and one of the most important for me. And we're going to play a little video about that. Once again, I'd like you to reflect a little bit on when you have potentially narrowed the frame too much. To get a sense of the parameters in which we are making a decision is one of the most dangerous decision-making traps in the world. So we're going to play a little video about frame blindness, and I'd like you to think like we did in the previous round. When have you kind of been too narrow in your framing of a decision? And this is a really important one. So we're going to have a look at that quickly, play a little video regarding frame blindness.
How are you framing the question to be decided? Frame blindness is when you are not aware of how your definition of what needs to be decided shapes what options you consider. For example, you may be asking an overly narrow question, or just solving the problem as stated, and missing the bigger picture. You may define the decision in a way that causes you to overlook the best options. Or you might be unwittingly influenced by other people's frames, preventing you from seeing better alternatives. Frame blindness occurs most often when there are time pressures, when people get lost in the details and think about their decision too narrowly, or when no one takes responsibility for exploring what really needs to be decided. It can lead to pursuing the right answers to the wrong questions. Tips for avoiding frame blindness include: if you are deciding between only one or two options, your frame is too narrow. Ask yourself, what else could we do? Generate at least 3 or 4 realistic alternatives for your decision. Check to see if the decision options you are considering could be based on old assumptions about the situation. Avoid narrowly defining the decision early in the process, as you may inadvertently anchor others on your definition of the decision and limit other options.
Welcome back. So this one is a really, really dangerous trap. And, I often think about, how we manage little kids like toddlers. One of the techniques that we are told with toddlers is that don't ask them, do you want to go to bed? Because they will say no. Give them a choice to say, do you want to go to bed in 10 minutes or in 15 minutes? Now that's appropriate to kids because we are trying to narrow the frame and give them structure. But it's very important to not allow yourself to get sucked into a frame blindness trap. All decisions are not either or decisions, right? Folks, I've kind of lost the... So when we think about frame blindness and the decisions, we often are bamboozled into thinking of it's either one or the other. So here's a good example. We have to lock everything down to save lives, or we have to open everything up and save the economy. That makes an exceptionally complex situation one that is a choice between one option or the other option. We currently see a lot of this in the world as well. You're either with us or you're against us. Right? It's either you are in this situation or you're in that situation. We should go completely online or we should go only to the grocery store. So, one of the challenges with frame blindness is it narrows your decisions beyond a space where you have enough space to make a good decision. Should I buy a Nissan or should I buy a Toyota? Maybe you shouldn't even buy a car. Maybe you should use ride-sharing services. Maybe you should use public transport. Should I take job A or should I take my own or start my own business? Maybe it's a combination of both. So whenever you feel yourself narrowing down your decisions to, I must do this or I must do that, there's always a possibility to open up and create more options for yourself, which will create better decision making. So I want to quickly learn from you. So yes, Nadir, absolute. Narrow framing can be useful if we have too many options. Absolutely. And it's almost like having enough options to choose from. Because if you have too many options, you go into another trap, which is analysis paralysis. But I'd like you to think about in chat just one opportunity where you kind of did that, where you got into a situation where you narrowed a decision down too much, and that kind of made it harder for you. Just pop into chat a couple of examples of when you've had the experience of a decision that you actually narrowed the frame too much? Should we do X or should we do Y? Give me some perspectives. You folks have been fantastic in the chat so far. Give me some perspectives of, how do we avoid that? Now, this is very important in the context of leadership. Leaders who create binary decisions too early often cut people off from other solutions that they could come up with that are possibly outside even the leader's perspective. Should we launch product A or should we launch product B? Well, maybe we should think of several products we could launch. Should we reduce prices or should we increase prices? Maybe we could increase prices, but at the same time, add more value to the package. So as leaders, if there are leaders on the call today, really, really important that you do not inadvertently anchor people in a binary decision. Don't send people away with, you can either do this or that. That's appropriate for toddlers, but for thinking, good talent in your business. So let's get some views. Any of you had an experience recently where you may have framed your decision? Yeah, there's a good one. Online learning or should they go to school? Which one should we go for? Fantastic example, Dr. Emmard. Maybe it could be a combination. Our schools at the moment here in South Africa, where I am, are open on a Monday, a Wednesday, and a Friday, so that they can have lower capacity. So it's a combination. Magda, great one there. Should I see my parents or now or not? Maybe I could increase the number of video conferencing. Maybe I can find other ways of connecting with them. Maybe if I do see them, I'm able actually to just make sure that I see them outside in an open space where I don't have the risk. Absolutely, Mona. Sometimes we need to narrow the framing. That could be a way of overcoming analysis paralysis as well, right? It could, of course, if we have too many options, come in the way of efficiency. Marwa, absolutely. The big decision is to always, and I want to get a little bit into some fantastic ones there. There's a great one there. Convert the government into e-transformation government, right? Should it be one or the other? So a couple of ideas about how we can avoid the frame blindness trap. The first thing is, if you are deciding between only two options, chances are pretty good that your frame is too narrow, right? Always try and create a third option at least for you. And that kind of helps us tread that path between kind of too much choice and too little choice. The other aspect is, what else can we do? Let's have at least 3 or 4 options. That's great. Should we buy a piece of gym equipment online? Very expensive. Should I wait for a physical store? Fantastic ideas. Maybe I could just try it out. Maybe I can find other ways of working out. If you're the leader, do not define the question too early in the process. You can always narrow down decisions later on, but in the beginning, allow people a lot of leeway to say, what other issues can you actually come up with? There's a concept in decision-making called anchoring, and I'm sure you've all had that experience, and that's actually one of the discussions we have in the longer program, is to say, sometimes when I say to you, this vehicle is going to cost $50,000, but I'm able to offer you a discount, and we might be able to get it at $30,000. All of a sudden, $30,000 sounds like a great deal. But if I said, we generally sell these vehicles for $20,000, but at the moment, the best price we can give you is $30,000. I've been anchored to that specific perspective. So frame blindness links to all of the other decision traps. But what I'd like you to do is, when you find yourself sliding into an either-or decision, just stop for a moment and say, is there a third way? Is there a third way? Does that make sense? Excellent. We're going to look at another trap. I'm really enjoying the conversation with you folks. One that we're going to look at now is a trap that is very, very dangerous at the moment, and we see it a lot. The status quo trap. Now, this is a trap that occurs when we have a sense of things being pretty much the way they've always been. So we're going to look at a quick video, and you know exactly what I'm going to do after this video. I'm going to ask you to think about a time where you might have anchored your decision making on the status quo. It's specifically in a time when the status quo does not exist. Right? We will probably never go back to the same sense of normality we had before. So I'd like you to quickly have a look at the status quo trap, and then we're going to discuss how does our conception of what normal is constrain our decision making.
There is an almost universal tendency to perpetuate the status quo and maintain things as they are, even when that may be significantly less than optimal. This trap is likely to occur when there are a lot of choices. The more overwhelming the number of choices, the more likely we are to default to the status quo. It is also found in organizations where trying something new and having it not go well is punished more than doing nothing. Or when people are not willing to take risks or take responsibility for changing a less than ideal situation. The status quo trap results in opportunities lost because they are not acted upon. It creates stuckness and a hesitancy to make positive change. Key tips for avoiding the status quo trap include: focus on the larger objectives of the decision. Will sticking with the status quo help achieve them? Name the key features of the status quo. Evaluate it alongside other options, as if it were another new option. Recognize that the status quo was once a good choice, but things change. Will it address what is changing?
Right, so we were just watching the video about the status quo trap. And what I'd like us to think about now is what creates this type of situation. Now, this is typically where you are invested in something. We've always done it that way. We've planned it. We might as well go ahead with it. This is my routine. I've always done it this way. This is the way that I've always done things. So it's easier to do things the way that you actually done it before. So if this is how it's always worked, it can easily get in the way of us actually not finding new opportunities. And it's specifically dangerous at the moment, right? So once again, if you think of when you have made a decision in the last while, where you have experienced this specific trap, where have you experienced that? We're going to quickly in the chat, where have you kind of experienced this trap in the sense that you went with the way that you've always done things and found that it's not the greatest decision? Let's quickly share one that is a status quo decision and that may not actually be optimal anymore. I think all of us in the learning and development space have not been able to embrace the status quo, right? We know that it's going to be a long time before people can be in a room together. So just share with me maybe a decision that you've made recently that possibly was based on the sense that tomorrow will be like yesterday was. Give us some decisions. Jitena talks about an old method. Absolutely. Trying to introduce a new service but postponing. Absolutely. I love that, Aurelia. So we think like, if we just wait, things will go back to normal. And that's such a difficult decision to make at the moment. Do we wait it out? Will things ever go back to normal as they were? And that is a real challenge. Selling products like hotcakes, absolutely. Those companies that were able to pivot quickly enough have been able to do that. Excellent. So when we want to avoid the status quo trap, the first thing is that it was once a good choice. Don't kind of disparage the past, but ask whether that is still optimal today. And quite often, we are creatures of habit quite often as human beings. We like things to stay more or less the same. But ask yourself, if you could rewind to an earlier time, what would you have done given today's situation? Well, the status quo trap is one where we kind of need to give ourselves the ability of saying, if I had not invested all of this, absolutely, we trying to wait for everything to come back to normal, right? So absolutely, using emails as a primary means, absolutely, some really good ones coming through there. So I'd like to talk about a couple of additional traps, and then we're going to do a little poll about what other potential traps there are. The one that we've spoken about a lot is information overdose, where we try to think that if we only got endless information, then we will be able to get this done. So if we just as much information as possible, we can actually get that. And there's an amazing kind of perspective that is sometimes used in the military, which is act when you have 70% of the information. Act if you have 70% of the information. So don't wait until you have all the information, but then it'll be too low. The other one is the loss aversion. We hate to lose. So quite often we find that if we say to someone, there's this operation that you can undergo, which will be successful for your specific condition, and this operation has an 80% success rate, versus someone saying there's this operation that you can go for, but 20% of people actually don't survive the operation. The way you frame the one against the other would make a massive difference in terms of the way that you make that decision. So that's a really important one. Information overdose, waiting for too much information, loss of aversion, sunk cost is one that we've spoken about. We've spoken about anchoring, where you actually think of, because you have some sense of what the anchoring point was, you don't want to go too far from it. So there's a couple of decision traps that we shared with you. One that's quite common is confirming evidence. So that means that we are primed to find the evidence that supports our point of view. There's a horrible quote of a certain president that is currently in power. I won't say who he is. And somebody asked him, he's big data analyst, said, my job is to find the evidence that corroborates my boss's view of the world. This is a true quote of a sitting president at the moment. I'll leave it to you to figure out who that might be. So that is confirming evidence. And then groupthink. We all think the same way, and therefore we don't give ourselves a different perspective. Confirmation bias, absolutely. And the problem with that is that quite often today we have people living in polarized worlds. So people on one type of spectrum only look at that media, and they consistently get confirmation, and it makes for poor decision making. I'll talk a little bit about those four traps: information overdose, confirming evidence, and groupthink. Those are all decision traps that we can quite easily fall into. Loss aversion, very powerful. We are primed to be more focused. There's that interesting example that if you have, for example, minced meat, and you say this meat is 90% fat-free, would you buy it, versus minced meat that has got 10% fat? If you saw that on the package, which way would you go? All right. So what I'd like to do quickly as a quick little poll, and we're coming towards the end of our webinar, I want to leave some time for us for some questions as well, is I'd like you to tell us, if you think of all these traps that we've gone through, which is the one that you have fallen into most in the recent while? Let's quickly have that poll. I would love to see where you are mostly falling into traps. And folks, thanks for being such a wonderful interactive group of people. We had a great conversation, great discussion. I could carry on for a long time, but I'm sure you all have things to do. So let us know, where are the ones that you have really struggled with? I can see loss aversion. Let me rather not do something that could get me to lose something. There's a horrible story from my part of the world where, you often have baboons who come into the fields where farmers have planted pumpkins. And the way that they actually catch these baboons is they cut a hole in the pumpkin that is only big enough for the baboon to put his hand into. But when he grabs the pips inside, his hand is too big to pull out. And they often find them there, and they're able to capture them stuck in that baboon stuck with his hand in the pumpkin, because he's holding on to the pips on the inside, right? So if you just let go, he could easily get his hand out. We often hold on to stuff. Information overdose, yes. Let me just find more and more and more information. Remember that tip: act when you are 70% sure, not 90% sure, not 50% sure, 70% sure, when you really have a good perspective. Excellent stuff going in there. And some folks in chat as well: status quo, confirmation bias. Absolutely. So I think we can start closing the poll. I've got some really good stuff. Information overdose. Now, the reason why information overdose is so insidious is because it slows us down. And I want to conclude with just a couple of ideas to finish the session, and then I would like very much for you to ask me any questions that you have. I'll hang around and answer your questions. So thank you very much for that. So what is the single best decision trap antidote? And that's a really interesting one. And that is, when we do this training, when we do the full 2-day training program, we often give someone like a little coaster, like a little place where you can put 2 coffee cups. And one of the most valuable ways of avoiding bad decision making is to have a trusted advisor that knows the traps. So if you get this sheet of traps, share it with your trusted advisor, get some feedback. What are the traps that I often fall into the most? Have someone to think with, a thinking buddy, not someone who will tell you what you'd like to hear, someone who knows you relatively well, and give them the sheet that we're going to give you, talk them through some of the traps, and actually give that person. Nadera, I love that one about loss aversion. Absolutely. We're so far down the line, let's not cut our loss. So how do you make a good decision when there are so many decision traps and we don't have perfect visibility about what's getting ahead? That's what we're all facing at the moment. The first thing is, and these are sort of my closing tips, absolutely, Jitendra, group discussion is a great one. It just amplifies that perspective. Decision making always involves uncertainty. That is always the case. That's the first thing. Acknowledge that. And that it exists because we don't know the future, right? And we don't know if the decisions we make at the moment will lead to the best possible outcome. If there was no decision making, if we could take the perspective of the divine, we would not need to make decisions because we would know the future. But we are mortal, so we need to know that it involves decision making. Don't let the uncertainty derail you, right? Adapt. Don't just stick to the status quo. Think about what options you can generate for yourself, not just do what you've always been doing, and then decide. As I said right at the beginning, sometimes, of course, the best decision is the right decision. The second best decision is the wrong decision. Sometimes the worst decision is no decision at all. And then if you're a leader, be decisive. Okay, it's a really interesting quote there from Harvard Business Review, looking at 17,000 leaders. And they said the one thing that stands out is not so much whether you always have to get the right decision, but whether you are actually decisive. Gather the input, reduce the uncertainty as much as you can, but would be willing to make a decision. And not all decisions are one-way decisions. Sometimes decisions are small decisions that can be reversed easily. So those are 3 tips that I'd like to share with you. The good news is we are wired to reduce uncertainty. We are wired to see patterns. Our brain is a huge ally. But the problem is that we are sometimes impatient with the process. We don't sit with the process. We don't talk about it. And therefore we step into a situation where we either get paralyzed by consistently recycling. And I think from this point onwards, moving to the future is going to be quite different from the past. And that takes time. So be patient with yourselves. It's like driving in the fog. Slow is sometimes good. And a couple of tips. Think instead of blink. Give yourself some time. You don't have to react immediately. Sometimes argue with yourself. If your gut feel says A, just take a position that is opposite and find some evidence for that. Get folks to actually generate options for you. And remember that no decision is always a decision. Sometimes when you don't make a decision, you will sit on that decision for too long. So, last bit of advice. Sometimes the best attitude to have in these times of massive uncertainty is don't let negative predictions paralyze you. Right? Choose a mindset of sitting with curiosity. Be curious about what might happen. And I want to leave you with one last quote, and then I'd like to open the floor for comments and questions. And that is this quote from Voltaire. Uncertainty is uncomfortable, but certainty is sometimes absurd. And I'm not talking about certainty in the sense of faith. Certainty is a good thing. But in terms of our human world of information and decision making, let's live with the uncertainty and let's be comfortable with that. So thank you so much. Apologies for the slight breakdown in the middle. We had to just shift networks, and I hope you were still able to see me clearly. And now I am most happy to hang around and get some of your questions and answers. Any questions or answers that you have, please pop them into chat. I've really enjoyed the interaction with you.
Thank you, James. We will go ahead to take some time for questions now. Just a reminder, please be sure to type your question in the chat box on the right-hand side of your screen.
It's a pleasure, really. You guys have been a wonderful audience, so please keep them coming.
So we have a few questions. The first one is from Fahad. He's asking, how can we take decisions in industries that has been massively affected, like restaurants?
Yeah. Massively affected by, just say that again.
Massively affected like restaurants.
Yes, absolutely. So the first thing is not to be overwhelmed. And the second thing, there's a very interesting comment about pivoting by Simon Sinek, where he talks about when you have to shift massively, go back to why you exist. Don't pivot about why, pivot about how and what. If your passion is to feed people, create a bigger frame. Can I open my restaurant? Can I not open my restaurant? That'll be a really tough frame to live with, because the answer at the moment is you cannot. Can I create delivery services? Can I create other options of feeding people? Can I use my skills in a different way? And I think frame blindness is a massive impact on that. The other aspect is loss aversion and sunk cost. I've spent all this money on this restaurant. I'm losing all of this money by not being able to open. You're focusing so much on what you might have lost that you might not be thinking of options that are open in front of you. But you have my sympathy. It's a very, very tough place to be. Thanks for the compliments, folks. Other questions? Let's keep them coming. I will hang around for as long as there are questions to answer.
That would be great. So we have another question from Ibrahim. He's asking how we can overcome this situation in the business.
How we can?
How we can overcome this situation in the business.
I'm sorry.
I believe he means overcome.
Overcome. Okay. So one of the things that we need in organizations today is a really good decision-making process. And we talk about the tips, and we do the longer learning program. We talk about the tips around the kind of ways of going around this. But one of the things that I would say is make sure that you have conversations about decisions. You know, sometimes we are so busy in the day-to-day basis that we don't think about how we want to make this decision. And a good suggestion for me sometimes is simply to say, let us first think about how we want to make this decision and then make the decision. That's a very simple one. I've got one in the chat here from Nader, which is, how do we handle decision fatigue? Oh, that's a fantastic and powerful question. when we have so many decisions to make. And one thing that I like to do, and that comes out of some of the other material, is, Jeff Bezos from Amazon talks about two types of decision: type 1 decision making, type 2 decision making. Type 1 decision making are massive, complex, irreversible decisions. In our personal life, that'll be like getting married or having a child. It's a massive decision, and it deserves an enormous amount of focus. And those are called one-way doors. But you also have type 2 decisions, which are reversible. Maybe I don't have to decide about whether I want to have a child or not. Maybe my nephew can come and visit me for an afternoon, and I can see whether it's possible. So one of the things, Nadera, that I find really valuable is to differentiate in your decision fatigue about type 1 decisions and type 2 decisions. Type 2 decisions, which are reversible, lower cost, lower risk decisions. Be more playful and curious and do small experiments in that space. Don't make every decision a type 1 decision, because you will run out of emotional bandwidth and you'll get tired. So try and categorize. Can I turn a big decision, which is a type 1 decision, into a type 2 decision? Instead of saying, should I now invest in a massive new e-commerce business? Maybe I can try it out in a small scale just in my neighborhood and see where that works. I hope that helps, but it's a very challenging time. Other decisions, Mara, from your side that you want to share with us? Other questions? Sorry.
Yes, we have one more from Mohammed. He's asking, how can he avoid the availability trap?
Absolutely. And that's very tough. It's very tough because we are bathed in social media. We are bathed in news from around the world. One of the things that we find is just check yourself and say, can I bring some facts into this situation? Let me actually look at some factual analysis about this. I am petrified of getting the disease. What is the actual infection rate in my area? I think that everything is going to crash. We saw that with the oil price. Is this the end of oil? What's going to happen? Maybe if we look at some historical curves of how things have gone up and gone down, it helps to reduce the availability trap. So 2 things for the availability trap. First of all, get some factual information. And then secondly, take a slightly longer view. What has been the trends in the past? What has happened in the situation? And try to be very careful when you see something very high impact. So great question. Great question. Other quick questions. Keep them coming, folks.
So we have one more from Musfira Al-Ghadi. She has been super active on the Arabic room. She's asking, it is better to set specific Is it better to set specific controls without total closure and to allow the influencing parties over our lives?
So is she saying, is it better to have total lockdown, or is it better to leave people to make their own decisions? Is that what we're saying?
She's asking, would it be better if we have like specific controls, or we can take like we can accept the total controls from the government?
Yeah, so that's a very difficult decision to make. And I think that there's been very different approaches to this. If we think of South Africa, for example, we had a very severe lockdown. A lot of decisions were made for us. You look at a country like Sweden, where it's very open. It's very difficult to say which way it's going to go. What I do think is really important is whether you have the decision to make or not, give yourself the space to think about how you would do this. Avoid the traps. And one of the things that she's referring to, which is really important, is anchoring. The authorities will give a specific framework, but within that framework, think about, where do you stand? What is your position? And have that conversation or that discussion. We have a question here from Aurelia, which is that looking into a topic that required a decision may not be right from the other person's point of view. That is a fantastic decision. How do we look at different people's point of views. And one of the things that we work with when we look at the training program is to say, to look at a kind of an accountability model, such as a RACI. It's a little bit like the difference between if you have chicken sausages for breakfast, there's a difference between the chicken that contributed the sausages and the chicken that contributed the egg, right? So decision making should always be pushed into who should be accountable for this, who should be consulted, who should be informed, and who should we actually collaborate with. And different decisions require a different level of engagement, where you really have a almost sole right to decide, get input, get consultation, improve your decision, but where many people have to live with that decision, a more broad consultation process, still avoiding the same traps, but trying to talk more about how we will make that decision. So, excellent question. Any other questions coming in from your side?
So the last question we have for today is from Saleh. He's asking, would you recommend us to read this book, The Third Alternative by Stephen R. Covey?
I love anything by Stephen Covey, and I think anything that pushes you to think broader than just two options is fantastic. There's a lot of great stuff that you can read around the neuropsychology of decision making. And I think the more we can understand our brains and the way our brains try to help us by making things simpler, but sometimes either oversimplify it or push us in the wrong direction. So any book in terms of that is a fantastic book. Great. Anything else before we close up? Folks, it's been so wonderful to get your chats, your comments, and your engagements and your interactions. I wish we had much more time with you. So I will certainly, I look forward to you implementing this. Give yourself space for decision making and think about how you decide. Make that a practice, a daily practice. Draw a line down a piece of paper and say, these are my decisions, and this is how I want to make my decisions. And I wish you well. I wish you safety. Inshallah, we'll be able to see each other soon in person again. I really miss being in the region. That's one of my favorite places to be. And thanks to Vigor. It was so wonderful to see the questions, the comments, and apologies for the technical hitch in the middle. And thank you so much to my wonderful MC who kept everything going in the process. So thank you so much. It's been great being with you.
Thank you, James. With no doubts, we knew we will have an informative and amazing webinar with you. Thank you so much for your time and effort. As a strategic and exclusive partner in the region with Mr. James, we would like to thank you all for being a part of this great webinar. For more information and details about in-house workshops with Mr. James, please contact us on contact@vigorenterprise.com. Also, please make sure to fill the survey that will be sent to you on your registered email so you can get a copy of this webinar summary. We at Vigor Enterprise are glad to announce our upcoming live free webinar, Building Mental Toughness in Challenging Times, which will be held on June 13th. Please watch the next video to get more information and visit our website to register. Thank you again from Vigor Enterprise and VDLH. Stay safe, wash your hands, and see you soon.
Hi, I'm Eugene, international motivational speaker and mental toughness expert. On the 13th of June at 4 p.m., I'll be collaborating with Vigor Enterprise to bring you a webinar titled Building Mental Toughness in Challenging Times. As a lawyer and investment banker who went into business and lost it all, I rose from my challenges and am now an award-winning speaker with 5 businesses under my belt. In this webinar, I will be teaching you the concept of mental toughness and how you can use it to not just rise, but thrive in these challenging times to become the success that you ought to be. So join me on the 13th of June with Vigor Enterprise for this powerful webinar.